The morning light of November 12, 1884, crept through the grimy windows of Joseph Brenner's workshop like honey through cheesecloth, slow and golden, catching every mote of gold leaf dust that hung in the air. Our master gilder, 42 years of age and feeling every winter in his knuckles, was already at his bench, preparing rabbit skin glue in the old copper pot his father had left him. The smell of it, earthy, animal, honest, mingled with the sharp scent of linseed oil and the metallic tang that gold leaf leaves on everything it touches. Vienna was changing outside his window. The listener might imagine the peculiar music of that decade, horse hooves on cobblestones mixing with the occasional proud honk of those new motorized carriages that frightened both animals and elderly ladies in equal measure. Electric streetlights stood beside gas lamps like emissaries from the future conferring with the past. Progress, they called it, though Joseph wondered if progress was simply another word for making things more complicated than they needed to be. "Another frame from Herr Goldman," Wilhelm announced, carrying in a Baroque monstrosity that had seen better centuries. The boy, though at 16 Joseph supposed he should stop thinking of him as such, set it down with practiced care. Wilhelm had his mother's delicate features, poor soul, but his father's steady hands. Those hands would need to be steadier still if the boy was to make his way in this trade, or better yet, in the gymnasium Joseph couldn't quite afford. Not yet. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building in the 4th District, wedged between a kosher butcher and a coffee house where university students argued about Schopenhauer until the small hours. 3 years since Martha's death, and Joseph still caught himself setting out 2 cups for morning coffee. Grief, he'd learned, was like gold leaf. It settled into every crevice, becoming part of the surface, whether you wanted it there or not. The Morning Post brought the usual collection of bills and inquiries, but among them, something that made Joseph's fingers pause. Cream-colored paper, so thick you could almost taste the money in it, sealed with burgundy wax. The von Hartberg crest pressed deep, a rampant lion holding a golden key. Inside, the handwriting was precise as clockwork. Your expertise required for a delicate restoration. Discretion essential. Carriage will call at 2 o'clock. Joseph knew the von Hartberg name, of course, who in Vienna didn't. Old nobility, the kind that traced their bloodline back to the Holy Roman Empire and probably had documentation to prove it. They owned half of Lower Austria and a good portion of everyone's imagination. When such people summoned you, you went. You went, and you brought your best tools. And you remembered that these were people who could make or unmake a craftsman's reputation with a casual word at the right dinner party. The von Hartbergs? Wilhelm's eyes widened as he read over his father's shoulder, a liberty Joseph permitted only because the boy would need to learn to read clients as well as he read Gold's temperament. Perhaps, Joseph murmured, already mentally cataloging which tools to pack. Or perhaps someone playing at being them. We'll know at 2 o'clock. The listener should understand that in those days, a craftsman's reputation was currency more valuable than gulden. Joseph had built his slowly, carefully, like applying layer upon layer of bold before the gold. He was known for work that lasted, for silence when silence was needed, for never promising more than he could deliver. These qualities had kept him fed when other gilders starved, kept good clients coming back when cheaper alternatives emerged from the new factories. The carriage that arrived at 2 was everything the letter had promised. Black lacquer polished to a mirror finish. Brass fittings that caught the weak November sun. and a driver who looked like he'd been carved from the same oak as the coach itself. Joseph climbed in with his tool case, noting the velvet seats, the crystal in the window catches, the subtle smell of leather and privilege. Vienna unrolled outside the windows as they headed toward the first district, then beyond. The great Ringstrasse, that monument to imperial ambition, was still being finished in places. Scaffolding embraced half-completed facades like wooden fingers trying to hold tomorrow in place. They passed the new Court Opera, the Parliament building that looked like it had been transplanted from ancient Athens, the Rathaus with its Gothic aspirations. All of it spoke of empire, permanence, the absolute certainty that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would last forever. Joseph, who worked with gold that had already outlasted a dozen empires, was less certain. Nothing lasted forever except the human tendency to believe it would. The von Hartberg estate crouched on the city's edge like a well-fed cat, all satisfied weight and elegant lines. 3 stories of butter-yellow Baroque facade, windows that watched the approaching carriage with glazed indifference. The entrance hall of the von Hartberg estate possessed that particular quality of intimidation that only centuries of accumulated wealth can achieve. Joseph followed the butler, a man who moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had never hurried in his life, across marble floors that reflected the painted ceiling above. Cherubs and clouds, the usual Baroque theater of heaven that wealthy families installed to remind visitors to look up, always up, toward their betters. Baron Friedrich von Hartberg waited in what they called the portrait gallery, though it might have been more accurate to call it a monument to genetic persistence. The same strong jaw repeated itself across 3 centuries of canvases, the same pale eyes that seemed to judge you for sins you hadn't even contemplated yet. The Baron, 58 years old and wearing his authority like a well-tailored coat, stood before one particular portrait that dominated the room's eastern wall. Herr Brenner, the Baron said without preamble, what do you know of family curses? Joseph might have smiled at another time, in another place, but the Baron's face suggested this was no moment for levity. I know that gold doesn't care about curses, Excellence. It responds only to skill and patience. Indeed, the Baron gestured toward the portrait. This is Count Rudolf von Hartberg, my ancestor, died in 1742. The frame is original, and it requires your particular expertise. The listener should picture this. A man in the portrait whose face suggested he'd discovered life's great joke and found it wanting. Count Rudolph's painted eyes followed you with the persistence of a creditor. He wore the red and gold uniform of Maria Theresa's court, his hand resting on a globe as if he owned everything it represented. But it was the frame that drew Joseph's attention, a masterpiece of Baroque gilding, all scrolling acanthus leaves and cherubic faces, heavy as sin and twice as elaborate. It weeps, the Baron said simply. Joseph stepped closer, and yes, there it was, a fine golden dust on the portrait's lower edge, caught in the carved crevices like pollen. His trained eye immediately noted the unusual distribution, the way it seemed to emanate from the frame's upper portion. He reached out, then paused, seeking permission with a glance. Please, the Baron said. Though I should warn you, it only weeps when the family honor is compromised. The story came out in pieces, delivered with the reluctance of someone confessing to a priest they didn't quite trust. The frame had first wept in 1798, when a von Hartberg had killed a man in a duel over cards. Again in 1823, when another ancestor had abandoned his pregnant mistress. Most recently, 3 days ago, after what the Baron called an incident with my son. Maximilian has debts, the Countess Elizabeth von Hartberg announced, entering the gallery with the timing of someone who had been listening at doors. 52 years old, she carried herself like a woman who had never doubted her place in the world's hierarchy. 30,000 gulden, gambling debts, to people who don't accept excuses instead of payment. Joseph kept his face carefully neutral, though internally he calculated 30,000 gulden was more than he might earn in 5 years of steady work. Enough to buy a building, to send Wilhelm to university, to secure a future. These people spoke of it like spilled wine, an inconvenience to be mopped up. The frame wept the morning after we learned of it, the Baron continued, as it has done throughout our family's history, when we stray from honor. Joseph examined the frame more closely, running his fingers along the gilded surfaces. The gold was genuine, though applied over what felt like a copper base, common enough for the period. The construction was masterful, joints tight despite the centuries, the carved details still sharp. Yet something felt wrong about the weight distribution, a subtle imbalance that suggested hidden spaces. "I'll need to examine it properly," Joseph said. "In good light, with my tools. The restoration could take weeks." "You'll work here," the Countess declared. It wasn't a request. "We've prepared a workroom." "You may bring whatever assistance you require." A young housemaid appeared as if summoned by thought, though more likely by some invisible bell pull. 24 years old, Joseph guessed, with the kind of careful prettiness that knew better than to draw attention to itself. She curtsied with practiced precision. "Anna will see to your needs while you work," the Countess said. "She's trustworthy." The word carried weight, a warning wrapped in recommendation. As Joseph followed Anna through the estate's corridors, she walked with the particular gait of servants who had learned to be invisible. Quick but not hurried, quiet but not suspicious. The workroom they'd prepared was a former morning room, north-facing windows providing the steady light Gilders preferred. Someone had already moved in a sturdy workbench, though Joseph would need to bring his own specialized tools. "The frame," Anna said quietly. "The servants are afraid of it." Joseph looked at her more carefully. Intelligence flickered in her eyes like candlelight behind curtains. "And you?" "I think fear and respect often wear the same mask, Herr Brenner." That evening, back in his workshop, Joseph prepared for the commission ahead. He selected his finest brushes, his most reliable adhesives, the gold leaf he saved for the most important works. Wilhelm helped pack everything, asking questions that showed he understood this was no ordinary job. "Why would a frame weep gold, Father?" Joseph considered his answer carefully. The boy was old enough for certain truths. "Sometimes, Wilhelm, people need mysteries more than they need explanations. The question isn't why it weeps, but why they need it to." The workroom at the von Hartberg estate had become Joseph's temporary kingdom by the morning of November 14th. He'd arrived before the household properly woke, preferring to establish his rhythm without the weight of aristocratic observation. The frame had been carefully removed from Count Rudolph's portrait, and now lay on his workbench like a patient awaiting surgery, every cherub and acanthus leaf catching the pale morning light. Joseph's fingers traced the carved surfaces with the intimacy of a blind man reading fate in facial features. The craftsmanship spoke of the 1740s, certainly. He recognized the particular style of Viennese court artisans from that period, the way they balanced Italian influence with Germanic precision. Yet something nagged at him, a discord in the frame's music that his trained senses couldn't quite identify. Anna arrived with coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute Joseph drank at home, served in porcelain so fine you could see your fortune through it. She moved with that particular grace of servants who had learned to exist in the spaces between their masters' lives, present but not intrusive, essential but invisible. "The staff speaks of you," she said quietly, setting down the tray. "They say you restored the altar at St. Stephen's after the fire." Joseph nodded, continuing his examination. "Gold remembers heat differently than wood or stone. You have to coax it back to beauty, not force it." She lingered, and Joseph noticed how her eyes traveled across the frame with more than casual interest. "You read," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen how her gaze had tracked across his written notes. A flush crept up her neck. "The Countess doesn't know. I learned from the cook's daughter before she married." She paused, then added with a defiance that surprised them both, "Words shouldn't belong only to the wealthy." Before Joseph could respond, the door opened and Wilhelm entered, carrying Joseph's specialized tool case. The boy had taken 2 horse omnibuses to get here, his clothes still carrying the smell of pipe smoke and wet wool from the crowded morning transport. At 16, he was caught in that awkward territory between childhood and manhood, his voice occasionally betraying him with unexpected cracks. "Father, I've brought the microscope lens you requested," Wilhelm said, then noticed Anna. His attempt at a sophisticated bow would have been charming if it hadn't been so earnest. The listener might appreciate the subtle geometry that formed in that room. Joseph focused on his work, Wilhelm trying not to stare at Anna pretending not to notice, while very much noticing. Youth recognizing youth across the vast gulf of class. A story as old as Vienna itself, and just as complicated. Joseph had Wilhelm hold the frame at various angles, while he examined it through his jeweler's lens. That's when he found them. Tiny scratches along one section of the upper molding, almost invisible unless you knew to look. They formed a pattern, regular as clockwork, suggesting something had been opened and closed repeatedly over the years. His pulse quickened with the particular pleasure of discovery that craftsmen know when they understand something's secret. "Wilhelm," he said carefully, "fetch my finest brush from the case, the one made from squirrel hair." As his son searched through the tools, Joseph pressed gently along the scratched section. There, a nearly imperceptible give, a slight movement that shouldn't exist in solid wood. He made a mental note, but said nothing aloud. The walls in houses like this had ears, and some discoveries needed to ripen in private. The morning's work was interrupted by unexpected visitors. Leopold Strauss entered the workroom with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there, though Joseph knew he didn't. 50 years old, wearing a coat that cost more than it should have, given his modest success, Leopold had once been Joseph's partner before their philosophical differences about honest work had driven them apart. Behind him lurked a younger man Joseph didn't recognize, carrying a gilder's case. "Joseph," Leopold said with false warmth, "how pleasant to find you here. I'm working on the music room's mirrors. The Countess felt they needed attention." His eyes traveled over the disassembled frame with professional interest. "The famous weeping frame, is it?" Joseph kept his voice neutral. "As you see, just a frame requiring restoration." Leopold laughed, a sound like coins dropping into a collection plate. Just a frame. Come now. We both know the von Hartbergs don't summon Vienna's most expensive gilder for just anything. He stepped closer, and Joseph could smell the pomade in his hair, heavy and sweet. You always were too trusting, my friend. These people will use your skill and discard you like old gilt. Unlike you, who would never think of using anyone, Joseph replied mildly. The tension in the room grew thick as sizing before gold application. Anna had pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible, while Wilhelm stood protectively near the tool case. Leopold's assistant shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. I heard about your recent difficulties, Leopold continued, his voice dripping sympathy like honey from a cracked pot. Young Wilhelm here needs schooling, doesn't he? Education is so expensive these days. I could help, you know. We could work together again. Joseph met his former partner's eyes steadily. I choose my collaborations carefully now. Leopold's smile turned sharp. Pride is a luxury, Joseph. Remember that when you're calculating whether you can afford your son's future. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and be careful with that frame. I've heard it doesn't just weep gold. It reveals secrets. And the von Hartbergs don't appreciate anyone learning what should stay hidden. After Leopold left, the room seemed to exhale. Anna quietly returned to her duties, though not before catching Joseph's eye with a look that said she understood more than her station should allow. Wilhelm resumed his position, holding tools with renewed determination. The discovery came on November 16th, in that peculiar hour when afternoon surrenders to evening, and the world holds its breath between day and night. Joseph had sent Wilhelm home earlier. The boy needed to complete his studies, such as they were at the trade school, and now worked alone in the fading light. Or rather, he thought he was alone, until he realized Anna had been standing in the doorway for who knows how long, watching him work, with the patient attention of a cat observing a mouse hole. You found something, she said, not a question. Joseph's hands stilled on the frame. He'd spent 2 days mapping every surface, every joint, every place where one piece of wood kissed another. The scratches he'd discovered earlier had led him to a section of molding that felt different under sustained pressure, warmer, as if it remembered being touched. Now, with Anna as his unexpected witness, he pressed in a specific sequence he'd deduced from the wear patterns. The listener should imagine this moment, the soft click of a mechanism that had kept its secret for over a century, the way Joseph's breath caught in his throat, the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, as if Count Rudolph himself had leaned forward in his painted realm to watch. A section of the frame's upper crown swung inward on hinges, so precisely crafted they made no sound. Inside, Joseph discovered a marvel of mechanical ingenuity that would have impressed the clockmakers of Prague. A small copper container, green with verdigris, connected to what looked like, yes it was, a hygrometer made from horsehair. The hair, still intact after all these years, was stretched between 2 tiny brass points. Below it, a delicate lever system connected to a sliding panel over the container. Mother of God, Anna whispered, crossing herself. Joseph examined the mechanism with growing amazement. When humidity rose, the horsehair would expand, triggering the lever, which would open the panel and release whatever was in the container. The copper vessel still held residue, a fine powder that, when Joseph touched it to his tongue, tasted of metal. Copper dust with traces of gold overlay, creating the illusion of golden tears when dispersed. "Count Rudolph built this himself," Joseph murmured, recognizing the amateur but ingenious craftsmanship. "He was known as a clockmaker, wasn't he?" Anna nodded slowly. "The library has his journals."
"The Countess sometimes has me dust them." She paused, then added quietly, "I may have read some passages." They looked at each other across the vast gulf of their social stations, conspirators now in knowledge that could shake the very foundations of the von Hartberg family mythology. The frame didn't weep from divine judgment, it wept from humidity, from the breath of many anxious people gathered in one room, from the simple physics of horsehair and copper. Joseph's mind raced through the implications. Every family crisis that had triggered the frame's weeping, they all would have involved gatherings, arguments, confrontations in the portrait gallery, heated discussions that raised the room's humidity until Count Rudolph's mechanism performed its intended theater. "What will you do?" Anna asked. Before Joseph could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway. They both moved with practiced swiftness, Joseph closing the hidden compartment, Anna stepping back to an appropriate servant's distance.
Dr. Weiss entered, carrying his medical bag, though Joseph suspected the man had come for reasons unrelated to anyone's health. 45 years old, with the careful bearing of a man who held secrets, like some people held debts, Dr. Weiss studied Joseph with eyes that had seen too much and chosen to say too little. "Working late, Herr Brenner?" "The light was good today," Joseph replied evenly. The doctor approached the frame, running his fingers along its surface with surprising familiarity. "Beautiful work, isn't it? Count Rudolph was quite the craftsman. Did you know he studied with the Jesuits? They taught him that faith without evidence is mere superstition, but evidence without faith is mere mechanics." Joseph heard the test in those words, the careful probing. "I find that gold needs neither faith nor evidence, Herr Doctor, only skill." Dr. Weiss smiled thinly. "And yet the frame weeps. Surely that requires some faith." "Or understanding of natural philosophy," Joseph replied, meeting the doctor's gaze steadily. The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Anna had become utterly still, a human-held breath. Finally, Dr. Weiss nodded slowly. "Understanding can be a burden, Herr Brenner. Some knowledge serves no purpose except to destroy useful beliefs. And some beliefs destroy more than they preserve," Joseph countered. The doctor set down his bag and pulled out, to Joseph's surprise, a small vial of copper powder. "I come here every few months," he said quietly, "to check on the family's health. All of the family's health, including its myths." He looked directly at Joseph. "My predecessor passed this duty to me, as his predecessor did to him. We are, you might say, physicians to more than just the body." Joseph understood now. The mechanism needed maintenance, refilling. The doctor was its keeper, the guardian of a deception that had shaped the von Hartberg family for generations. "How long have you known?" "Since my first visit 20 years ago. My predecessor showed me, made me swear an oath." Dr. Weiss looked older suddenly, weighted by his secret. "At first, I was appalled.
Then I watched what the belief did, how it checked the family's worst impulses, how fear of the frame's judgment kept them from greater cruelties. "And Maximilian's debts?" Joseph asked. "The young man saw the frame weep 3 days ago. He wept himself, begged his father's forgiveness, swore to reform. He's been sober since, attending to estate business, even speaking of marriage to a respectable merchant's daughter he genuinely cares for." The doctor's voice carried a mixture of guilt and conviction. Would truth serve him better? Joseph thought of his own son, of the stories we tell ourselves to become better than we are. The frame was a lie, yes, but perhaps some lies were like scaffolding, ugly, temporary, but necessary to support something beautiful being built. The estate library occupied the entire West Wing's second floor, a cathedral of knowledge where books rose to the ceiling like learned prayers. Joseph found himself there on the morning of November 18th, having received unexpected permission from the Countess herself to research period-appropriate restoration techniques. What she didn't know was that Anna had already shown him, during the family's absence at Sunday Mass, exactly which volumes contained Count Rudolph's personal journals. The listener should understand that libraries in the 1880s were not the democratic spaces we know today. They were treasuries, hoarded wealth in leather and paper, each book a small fortune that whispered of its owner's sophistication. The von Hartberg Library smelled of leather and vanilla. That particular perfume of aging paper, mixed with the faint ghost of pipe tobacco from generations of men who had pondered weighty matters among these shelves. Joseph pulled down the third volume of Count Rudolph's journals, dated 1738 to 1740. The handwriting was precise, mechanical almost, as if the Count had approached even his private thoughts with the discipline of an engineer. Anna stood nearby, ostensibly dusting shelves, but actually keeping watch. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a passage she'd clearly read before. "July 12th, 1740. Joseph read aloud, quietly. "The family grows careless with its privileges. My son speaks to servants as equals. My daughter accepts gifts from inappropriate suitors. They mistake the accident of noble birth for personal virtue. I must devise a reminder that our blood carries obligation, not just advantage." The entries that followed detailed Count Rudolph's experiments with various mechanical devices. He wrote of studying with a master clockmaker in Prague, of his fascination with automata that could mimic life. But it was an entry from 1741 that made Joseph's hands still. "The frame is complete. I have tested the mechanism repeatedly. Humidity from 20 anxious breaths will trigger it reliably. The copper dust, kissed with gold, creates an effect both beautiful and terrible. Let future generations believe heaven itself weeps at their dishonor. Fear of divine judgment may succeed where paternal guidance has failed." Joseph heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly closed the journal. Baron Friedrich entered, his bearing slightly less rigid than usual, as if the weight of recent events had softened his spine just enough to make him appear human. "My wife tells me you requested historical context," the Baron said, gesturing for Joseph to continue sitting. The democratic gesture surprised them both. "Understanding the original craftsman's intentions helps with restoration," Joseph replied carefully. The Baron moved to the window, gazing out at grounds where gardeners were preparing beds for winter. Count Rudolph was a complicated man. My father spoke of him as if he were myth rather than ancestor. Brilliant, cold, obsessed with mechanisms, both physical and social. He turned back to Joseph. Do you know he once built a mechanical confessor? A wooden priest that would nod and grant absolution when you dropped a coin into its base. That seems sacrilegious, Joseph ventured. The Archbishop thought so, had it burned. The Baron's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. But the frame survived. The frame always survives. He moved closer, and Joseph could smell his cologne, bergamot and something sharper, medicinal perhaps. My son Maximilian has reformed remarkably since the frame wept. He's even spoken of love, genuine affection for the Kaufman girl, a merchant's daughter. The Baron's voice carried wonder, as if love itself were a mechanism he couldn't quite understand. You don't object to the match? Joseph asked, genuinely curious. Such unions were becoming more common as old money married new, but they still raised eyebrows in certain circles. I object to many things, Herr Brenner, but I've learned that some battles aren't worth fighting. The frame wept. That's judgment enough. He paused, then added quietly, My own marriage was arranged. 30 years of cordial distance. Perhaps my son deserves better. After the Baron left, Anna emerged from behind the shelves where she'd retreated. He loves his son, she observed. Most fathers do, Joseph replied, thinking of Wilhelm. We just don't always know how to show it without breaking something. They spent the next 2 days diving deeper into the family history. Joseph learned that the frame had wept 6 times over the centuries, always during family crises that threatened scandal. Each time, the family had pulled back from the brink, chastened by what they believed was divine intervention. Anna proved an invaluable assistant, her secret literacy allowing her to scan through volumes Joseph wouldn't have time to read. She found references to the frame in letters, account books, even in the diary of a governess from 1820 who described the family's terror when gold dust appeared after the bastard child incident. They never questioned it, Anna marveled during one of their clandestine research sessions. Never once did anyone suggest examining the frame closely. Why would they? Joseph replied. We see what we expect to see. And perhaps what we need to see. On November 20th, Dr. Weiss joined them unexpectedly in the library. He carried a leather portfolio that looked older than memory. Since you know the truth, he said without preamble, you should know all of it. Inside the portfolio were documents dating back 140 years. Notes from successive physicians who had maintained the frame's secret. Each had wrestled with the ethics of the deception. Each had ultimately decided that the lie served a greater good. Dr. Marcus Steinberg, 1798, Dr. Weiss read. The frame has prevented young Friedrich from dueling. A man lives who would have died. Can a lie that preserves life be truly called evil? Dr. Johann Frost, 1823, he continued. The family has acknowledged the bastard child, providing support. The frame's judgment accomplished what Christian charity could not. Joseph studied these testimonies of men who had carried this secret like a stone in their chest. Each had chosen to continue the deception, to tend the mechanism like priests tending an eternal flame. but at what cost to themselves? The night of November 21st brought the first real snow of winter, fat flakes that fell like secrets from heaven, covering Vienna's sins in temporary white innocence. Joseph had stayed late at the estate, telling Wilhelm he needed to work on a particularly delicate section of gilding. This was true, but not complete. He'd decided to analyze the powder residue more thoroughly, away from prying eyes. The workroom had grown cold, the ceramic stove in the corner fighting a losing battle against November's determination. Joseph mixed the powder sample with various solutions, watching how it reacted, tasting it again despite the danger.
Definitely copper. The green tinge of verdigris confirmed it, but overlaid with the thinnest possible layer of gold, just enough to catch light and create the illusion of pure golden tears. Anna entered without knocking, carrying hot tea and cold bread with butter. She'd taken to these evening visits, bringing sustenance and, more importantly, her sharp observations about the household's dynamics. Tonight, however, she looked troubled. "Dr. Weiss is here," she said quietly, "not for his usual visit. He and the Baron have been locked in the study for 2 hours." Joseph set down his tools. He'd been expecting this. The doctor couldn't have been comfortable knowing that others now shared his burden. The question was whether Weiss had come to threaten or negotiate. The answer came soon enough. Dr. Weiss appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in one hand and weariness etched in every line of his face.
"I thought I might find you here," he said to Joseph, acknowledging Anna's presence with a nod that suggested he'd long ago stopped being surprised by servants who saw more than they should. "I've told the Baron nothing," the doctor said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose bones had begun their rebellion against age. "But we need to discuss the future of our shared knowledge." Joseph noticed the "our," an inclusion that suggested alliance rather than antagonism. "What do you propose?" The doctor pulled out a small vial from his bag, identical to the one Joseph had seen before. "This is my burden, renewed every 3 months for 20 years. The copper comes from the pharmacy, the gold dust from a jeweler who asks no questions. I mix them myself, in proportions I learned from my predecessor." He set the vial on the workbench. "I'm 45 years old, Herr Brenner. If God grants me normal years, I have perhaps 20 more to guard this secret." "Then what?" "Then someone else takes your place," Joseph said simply. "Yes, but who? My own son studies medicine in Paris, speaks of bacteria and microscopes, dismisses what he calls medieval superstitions. He would expose the mechanism immediately, thinking himself righteous." Dr. Weiss rubbed his temples. "And perhaps he would be right. Perhaps it's time for truth." Anna spoke unexpectedly. "Last week, Maximilian spent an entire day with the estate's tenant farmers, learning their concerns. The Baron said he'd never seen his son show such interest in responsibility." The doctor nodded slowly. "The frame's judgment changed him, or rather his belief in the frame's judgment." He looked at Joseph. "You're a craftsman. You understand that sometimes the tool matters less than what it builds." Joseph thought of his own work, how gold leaf could transform base wood into something that inspired awe. Was the frame not doing something similar? Transforming base human nature into something nobler through fear of judgment? Yet the comparison troubled him. Gold leaf was honest decoration. This was deliberate deception. "Show me the complete mechanism," Joseph said finally. "If I'm to restore it properly, I need to understand it fully." They worked through the night, the doctor explaining every component while Joseph took mental notes. The horsehair hygrometer was ingenious. Human hair would have deteriorated, but horsehair could last centuries if kept dry. The release mechanism used watch springs that Count Rudolph had probably salvaged from pocket watches. The copper container had a capacity for about 3 months' worth of powder, released in tiny amounts. "The beauty is its simplicity," Dr. Weiss explained. "No one expects simplicity in a Baroque frame. They look for mysticism, for divine intervention, and so they find it." Around midnight, they heard footsteps approaching, too light for the Baron, too confident for a servant. Maximilian von Hartberg entered, still dressed in evening clothes that suggested he'd been at the opera. 28 years old, he had his father's jaw but his mother's eyes, and something in his bearing that suggested recent humbling. "Doctor," he said, then noticed Joseph and Anna, "and company. Forgive the intrusion, but I saw lights." The listener might imagine this tableau. 4 people in a cold room, each carrying different secrets, while snow continued to fall outside like heaven's own effort to obscure the truth. Maximilian's gaze fell on the frame, and his expression shifted to something between fear and reverence. "It hasn't wept again," he said quietly. "I check every day." "That troubles you?" Dr. Weiss asked carefully. "It comforts me. It means I haven't... that I'm maintaining the proper path." Maximilian moved closer to the frame, and Joseph noticed how his hands trembled slightly. "The Kaufmann family has accepted my suit. Christina, Miss Kaufmann, she sees something in me worth saving." "Perhaps she sees you accurately," Anna said, then immediately dropped her gaze, realizing she'd overstepped. But Maximilian smiled. "Perhaps she does. Or perhaps love is its own kind of beautiful deception." He turned to Joseph. "When will the restoration be complete?" "Soon," Joseph replied, understanding that he was being asked about more than just the frame. The conversation that would change everything began, as such conversations often do, with Leopold Strauss spreading poison disguised as concern. November 24th found Joseph in the estate's breakfast room, having arrived early to apply the first layer of new gilding to the frame's restored sections. The Countess had insisted he take his morning meal with the upper servants, a peculiar honor that placed him neither above nor below stairs, but somewhere in the uncertain middle. Leopold appeared like smoke from a bitter fire, uninvited but impossible to ignore. "My friend," he said, settling into the chair opposite Joseph without permission. "Vienna talks." Joseph continued buttering his bread with deliberate calm. "Vienna always talks. It's what keeps the coffee houses in business. They say you've been here 2 weeks, and the frame hasn't been seen. They say the Baron grows anxious. They say," Leopold leaned forward, his breath sour with last night's wine, "that perhaps the famous Joseph Brenner has discovered something he shouldn't have." Before Joseph could respond, Dr. Weiss entered, followed unexpectedly by Maximilian. The young man looked different from even a week ago. The dissipation around his eyes had faded, replaced by something Joseph recognized as purpose. He'd seen it in his own mirror after Martha's death, when raising Wilhelm became his only reason to continue. "Herr Strauss," Maximilian said coolly, "I wasn't aware you were dining with us this morning." Leopold rose slightly, caught between courtesy and defiance. "I came to consult with Herr Brenner about technical matters." "Then consult elsewhere," Maximilian replied. "This room is reserved for those actually working on our commissions." The dismissal was clear, but Leopold didn't retreat immediately. Instead, he looked at Joseph with something between pity and warning. "Pride comes before the fall, old friend. Remember that when you're weighing truth against comfort. After Leopold's departure, the room's atmosphere shifted like air after lightning. Dr. Weiss poured himself coffee with steady hands, though Joseph noticed the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. "He knows something. He suspects," Joseph corrected. "There's a difference." Maximilian sat down uninvited, a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "Gentlemen, I need to speak plainly. The frame, I know it's not supernatural. I'm not a fool. The listener should appreciate this moment, the careful dance of three men around a truth none wanted to speak aloud. Anna, who had been refilling the coffee pot, went completely still. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, the usual morning sounds muffled by the weight of impending revelation. "I studied natural philosophy at university," Maximilian continued, "before the gambling became everything. I know about hygrometers, about mechanical triggers. Count Rudolph was famous for his clockwork. It doesn't require much imagination to connect these facts." Dr. Weiss set down his cup carefully. "And yet you check the frame daily for tears." "Because," Maximilian said slowly, as if working out the thought while speaking it, "sometimes we need external structures for internal truths. The frame may be mechanical, but my shame was real. My reform is real. Christina's love is real." Joseph found himself unexpectedly moved by the young man's honesty. "You want us to maintain the deception." "I want you to improve it," Maximilian said firmly. "Make it less damaging to the frame itself. Dr. Weiss has shown me the copper powder. It's slowly corroding the original gold. In another generation, the frame will be destroyed by its own miracle." This was the moment when Joseph understood that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. The young wastrel had seen what none of them had fully grasped, that the mechanism was consuming the very thing it was meant to preserve. "I've been thinking about that," Joseph admitted. "A sealed glass reservoir instead of copper, a finer powder that won't oxidize, perhaps a different trigger mechanism that doesn't require monthly maintenance." They spent the next hour in unexpected collaboration, three men from different worlds united by a shared secret. Anna contributed observations about the family's patterns when they gathered in the portrait room, what conditions created the most humidity. Dr. Weiss provided medical insight about perception and belief. Maximilian offered his knowledge of mechanical principles and, more surprisingly, his understanding of his family's psychology. "My father needs the frame," Maximilian said quietly. "Not because he's weak, but because he's strong in a world that no longer values his kind of strength. The frame gives him purpose, makes him guardian of something greater than land or title." Joseph thought of his own father, a gilder who died young from the mercury used in old techniques. Each generation carried the burdens of the previous one, sometimes literally in their lungs and bones. "And your children?" he asked. "Will they need the frame?" "Perhaps not," Maximilian admitted. "But by then it will simply be a family heirloom with an interesting story. The truth can sleep until it's safe to wake." That evening, Joseph worked alone on the new mechanism, Wilhelm having returned home after a day of assistance. His son had been quiet lately, absorbing the strange education this commission provided, lessons in craft, certainly, but also in the complex morality of truth and kindness. Anna appeared with her usual evening tea, but this time she also carried a small leather journal. "Count Rudolph's private notes," she said, placing it carefully on the workbench. "The ones not in the library. I found them hidden in the china cabinet." Joseph opened it carefully. finding pages of mathematical calculations, drawings of gears and springs, and finally, near the end, a single paragraph in different ink. I have created a god to judge my descendants, knowing full well that I am only a man pretending at divinity. May they forgive me, or may they be wise enough to maintain the pretense. Sometimes, fear of judgment creates the only justice we achieve. November 27th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that makes Vienna look like an illustration from a children's book, all clean lines and promise. Joseph had been working since before sunrise, applying the final touches to the frame's new hidden mechanism. The glass reservoir he'd crafted would hold the powder without corrosion, while the improved trigger would respond more reliably to humidity changes without the monthly maintenance that had burdened Dr. Weiss for 2 decades.
Wilhelm worked beside him, having gained permission from his trade school to count this as practical experience. The boy had grown during these weeks, not just in skill, but in understanding. He'd learned to read the silence between words, to see how craftsmanship extended beyond mere technical excellence into the realm of human necessity. "Father," Wilhelm said quietly, adjusting the tiny spring they were installing, "what we're doing, is it right?" Joseph had been expecting this question. "What do you think?" The boy considered, his hands never pausing in their delicate work. I think sometimes the kindest thing we can do is preserve someone's useful beliefs. Like when Mother was dying, and you told her I'd become a great craftsman. She believed it, and it gave her peace. Joseph's throat tightened. He hadn't known Wilhelm remembered those last days so clearly. "And have I made a liar of myself?" "No," Wilhelm said simply. "You made a promise real by believing it could be." The listener might consider how wisdom sometimes comes to us through our children, reflected back like light from carefully polished gold. Joseph saw in his son's understanding a maturity that had been purchased with loss, but refined with love. Anna arrived with an unusual companion, Christina Kaufmann, Maximilian's intended. 23 years old, she possessed the particular beauty of someone who had never tried to be beautiful, just genuinely interested in the world around her. Her father's merchant money showed in her clothes' quality, but her own character showed in how she wore them without ostentation. "Herr Brenner," she said, offering her hand to shake rather than to kiss, a modern gesture that marked her as part of Vienna's changing social landscape. "Max has told me about your work. May I watch?" Joseph glanced at Anna, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Christina could be trusted, it seemed. "If you wish, Fräulein." What followed was an unexpected education for all involved. Christina asked intelligent questions about the gilding process, the chemistry of adhesion, the history of the techniques. She revealed that her father had started as a chemist before building his fortune in textile dyes, and she'd grown up in laboratories and workshops. "Max says the frame has a reputation," she said carefully, watching Joseph apply gold leaf with a brush made from squirrel hair. "That it weeps when the family strays." "All families have their stories," Joseph replied neutrally. Christina smiled. "My family's story is that my grandfather was a rag picker who found a wallet full of money and returned it to its owner. The owner, impressed by his honesty, gave him a job that started our fortune." She paused. "The truth is,
Grandfather stole the wallet first, then felt guilty and returned it.
The guilt created the goodness. Wilhelm nearly dropped his tool in surprise at this casual admission. Anna covered a smile. Joseph found himself reassessing this young woman who would join the von Hartberg family. "You don't believe in comfortable lies," he observed. "I believe in uncomfortable truths that lead to comfortable lives," Christina corrected. "Max was destroying himself with gambling because he felt worthless, a decorative aristocrat in an age that values production. The frame's judgment gave him permission to change. Does it matter if that permission came from heaven or horsehair?" The door opened and Leopold Strauss entered without announcement, his face flushed with triumph. "I knew it," he declared, pointing at the exposed mechanism. "I knew you'd found something. The great Joseph Brenner maintaining a family fraud." The room erupted in controlled chaos. Wilhelm stepped protectively toward his father. Anna moved to block the door, and Christina, surprising everyone, laughed. "Herr Strauss," she said sweetly, "how wonderful that you're here. My father has been looking for someone to restore the gilt work in our new factory. Such a large commission. Hundreds of frames for the executive offices. We were going to offer it to Herr Brenner, but clearly you're the more ambitious craftsman." Leopold's expression shifted from triumph to calculation. Joseph recognized the number being computed behind those eyes. Hundreds of frames meant thousands of gulden, enough to eclipse any satisfaction from exposing Joseph's secret. I would need to consider," Leopold stammered. "Of course," Christina continued smoothly, "though father does insist on absolute discretion from his contractors. Industrial espionage is such a concern these days." "Anyone who shows a tendency toward revealing other people's business." She let the threat hang in the air like gold dust. Dr. Weiss entered at that moment, taking in the scene with practiced calm. "Herr Strauss, I believe the Countess is looking for you. Something about the mirrors in the music room being installed incorrectly." Leopold looked at each face in turn, seeing his defeat written in their unity. "This isn't over, Joseph," he said quietly. "Truth has a way of surfacing." "So does scum," Wilhelm said under his breath, earning a sharp look from his father, but an approving nod from Christina. After Leopold's retreat, the work continued with renewed purpose. The improved mechanism was installed, tested, documented in a secret compartment Joseph created specifically for future craftsmen who might need to maintain it. He included a letter, signed and dated, taking responsibility for the modification. The 1st of December brought Vienna under a thick blanket of snow that muffled sound and softened edges, making the city look like one of those glass globes children shake to create miniature blizzards. The frame had been reinstalled 3 days prior, and today the von Hartberg family would gather to see the completed restoration. Joseph arrived early, as was his habit, to ensure everything was perfect. The gilt catching light at precisely the right angles, the mechanism invisible even to those who knew where to look. The portrait gallery had been transformed for the occasion. Chairs arranged in a semicircle faced Count Rudolph's portrait, and someone, Joseph suspected Anna, had placed fresh pine boughs around the room, their scent mixing with the smell of beeswax candles. The frame gleamed with renewed life, the gold seeming to pulse with its own inner warmth. Baron Friedrich entered first, moving slowly as if approaching something sacred. He stood before his ancestor's portrait for a long moment, and Joseph saw his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or simply conversation with the past. The Countess followed,
then Maximilian with Christina on his arm, then Dr. Weiss, and finally unexpected guests. Several of the estate's senior servants, including Anna, who had apparently been invited to witness this moment. "Herr Brenner," the Baron began formally, "you have restored more than a frame. You have restored a family's connection to its history." Joseph bowed slightly, uncomfortable with ceremony but understanding its necessity. "The frame wanted only to reveal its original beauty, Excellence. I merely removed what time had added." Maximilian stepped forward, and Joseph noticed he was holding a small box. "Before we continue, Father, there's something I need to say. These past weeks have taught me about the weight of inheritance, not just of wealth or land, but of responsibility." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring. "Christina has agreed to become my wife, to join her strength to our tradition." The Countess gasped, not in disapproval, Joseph realized, but in something approaching joy. Christina moved to stand beside her future mother-in-law, and in that moment, the listener might understand how alliances between old and new money were really alliances between different kinds of wisdom. "The frame remains silent," Baron Friedrich observed, and there was relief in his voice. "It approves." Dr. Weiss caught Joseph's eye, and they shared a moment of understanding. The frame would remain silent because the room's humidity was controlled now, the gathering too small and calm to trigger the mechanism, but also because some truths were better left sleeping. "Herr Brenner," the Baron continued, "your payment." He handed Joseph an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. "And something additional. Wilhelm has been accepted to the gymnasium through my recommendation. His fees will be covered by a scholarship the family has established for promising young craftsmen." Joseph's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope. Inside, he knew, was not just payment, but possibility. His son's future secured, the weight of worry lifted. Wilhelm, standing near the door, looked stunned, his youth showing through his carefully maintained professional composure. Excellence, this is too generous," Joseph managed. "It's precisely calculated," the Countess interjected. "We've learned the value of good craftsmanship and of discretion." The gathering shifted into something less formal. Christina engaged Wilhelm in conversation about his studies, showing genuine interest that made the boy blush. Anna brought in coffee and cakes, moving with new confidence. Joseph had heard she would be promoted to head housemaid, with permission to formally study reading and writing. Leopold Strauss appeared briefly in the doorway, ostensibly to collect his tools from the music room. He looked at the restored frame, at the family gathered beneath it, at Joseph standing among them as an equal, if only for this moment. Something passed across his face, not defeat exactly, but perhaps understanding. He nodded once to Joseph, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or warning, then disappeared. "Tell me, Herr Brenner," Maximilian said, approaching with Christina, "do you think future generations will understand what this frame means?" Joseph considered his words carefully. "I think each generation understands what it needs to understand. The frame will tell them different stories, all of them true in their own way." Christina smiled. "Like the story of my grandfather's wallet. The truth changes depending on who needs to hear it." Snow continued to fall outside, visible through the tall windows, covering the estate grounds in pristine white. The frame caught the light from the candles and threw it back transformed, golden shadows dancing on the walls like memories of future moments not yet lived. Dr. Weiss approached Joseph quietly. The mechanism. You've improved it remarkably. It should last another century without intervention. Or until someone needs to find it, Joseph replied. I've left instructions, sealed in a place only a true craftsman would look. The doctor smiled sadly. You've given me a gift, you know. The burden feels lighter, shared. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on the quality of those rare moments when social boundaries blur and humans recognize each other simply as humans.
The Baron told stories of his military service. The Countess revealed a surprising knowledge of chemistry gained from Christina. And even Anna was coaxed into sharing a folktale from her grandmother. January in Vienna, 1885. The listener should imagine a morning so cold that breath becomes visible poetry. Each exhalation, a small ghost that dissipates before the next line can be spoken. Joseph stood in the nave of St. Stephen's Cathedral, applying gold leaf to a restored section of the altar screen, his hand steady despite the chill that crept through the ancient stones. 2 months had passed since the von Hartberg Commission, and life had settled into new rhythms, like gold finding its place in the grooves of carved wood. Wilhelm was at the gymnasium now, his days filled with Latin and mathematics, instead of rabbit skin glue and sizing. The boy came home exhausted but exhilarated. Speaking of ideas Joseph only half understood, something about electric currents and chemical reactions, the new sciences that would shape the coming century. Yet on Sundays, Wilhelm still joined his father in the workshop, his hands remembering the old crafts, even as his mind reached toward tomorrow. The letter from Anna had arrived that morning, written in the careful script of someone still delighting in the ability to form words on paper. She was teaching now. Not formally, that would be impossible for a woman of her station, but quietly in the evenings, showing other servants how letters became words. Words became thoughts. Thoughts became freedom. She wrote that the frame hadn't wept once since its restoration, that Maximilian and Christina's wedding had been beautiful in its simplicity, that the Baron had begun treating his servants less like furniture and more like humans. The frame stands silent, she wrote, but its silence speaks volumes. Joseph understood. Sometimes the absence of something was more powerful than its presence. The frame no longer wept because the family no longer needed those tears. They had found other ways to hold themselves accountable. Dr. Weiss had visited the workshop the previous week, bringing news and a bottle of good Hungarian wine. He looked younger somehow, as if releasing his secret burden had restored years to his life. "I've taken on an apprentice," he'd said. "A young physician who believes in both science and wisdom. When the time comes, perhaps he'll be ready to inherit more than just my practice." They'd talked until late. 2 middle-aged men who had shared something profound and strange. The doctor had revealed that Count Rudolph's other mechanical creations had been found in the estate's attic. Clockwork birds that sang when wound, a mechanical fortune teller that selected random biblical verses, a music box that played different melodies depending on the weather. All of them speaking to a man who understood that wonder didn't require magic, only craftsmanship and imagination. Leopold Strauss had taken the Kaufmann commission and by all accounts was doing respectable work. He'd even sent Joseph a note, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. "We each gild our own truths," he'd written. "Yours simply shine brighter." The listener might wonder what Joseph made of all this, standing in the cathedral with gold leaf trembling between his fingers like captured sunlight. He thought about truth and deception,
about the stories we tell ourselves to become better than we are. The frame had been a lie, yes, but also a kind of truth. The truth that humans need external structures for internal growth, that fear of judgment can create its own justice, that sometimes the most honest thing we can do is maintain a beautiful fiction. He thought about Count Rudolph, dead these 143 years, who had created not just a mechanism but a conscience for his descendants. Had he known that future generations would discover his secret? Had he counted on it? Perhaps he had simply done what craftsmen always do, created something beautiful and functional, then trusted time to reveal its true purpose. The cathedral work was simpler than the frame. No hidden mechanisms, no moral complexities. Just the straightforward task of making something beautiful, more beautiful still. Yet even here, Joseph found himself creating small secrets. Behind one section of restored gilt, he placed a note. Joseph Brenner, Gilder, January 1885. The gold remembers everything. Let some future craftsman find it and wonder. As he worked, Joseph recalled a conversation with Christina from that snowy December day. She'd asked him if he believed in God, a bold question from a young woman to an older craftsman. He'd thought carefully before answering, "I believe in gold, Fraulein. It's eternal, honest, and beautiful. If God exists, he probably appreciates good gilding." She'd laughed, but then grown serious. "And yet you helped maintain an illusion." "Did I?" Joseph had responded. "Or did I help maintain a truth that needed a mechanical assistant to be heard?" Now, in the cathedral's sacred silence, Joseph understood that both were true. We are all mechanisms, in our way, responding to pressures and triggers, releasing our gold dust when conditions demand it. The difference between humans and machines was not that we were less predictable, but that we could choose our own mechanisms, wind our own springs, create our own frames for living. The gold leaf settled onto the carved wood with a whisper like prayer. Tomorrow, Wilhelm would begin his second term at the gymnasium. Anna would teach another servant to read. Maximilian would work to deserve Christina's faith in him. Dr. Weiss would heal bodies while guarding gentle secrets. The frame would remain silent, its mechanism patient as clockwork, waiting for humidity that might never come again. And Joseph would continue his work, transforming base materials into beauty, knowing that sometimes the most profound truths were told in gold.